Ladies and gentlemen, today we're taking a raunchy romp through medieval times where the birds sang, the mead flowed, and the sex was, well, a bit strange to say the least. Yes, there was sex in the Middle Ages, but trust us, it wasn't your typical 50 Shades of Grey scenario. Thanks to the rules and regulations set forth by the holier-than-thou clergy, the relationships between men and women were anything but vanilla. Now, when most people think of the Middle Ages, they conjure up images of brave knights and fair maidens and their romantic courtship shrouded in mystery and intrigue. But what they don't tell you is that it was also known as the Dark Ages. And for good reason. During this time, the Church and the Holy Inquisition had their noses stuck in everyone's business, especially when it came to the bedroom. And while the ancient Romans and Greeks had a much more liberal view on sexual relationships, the average medieval citizen was about as free as a chastity belt. So buckle up, folks, as we delve into the tantalizing and titillating world of sex in medieval times. Just be glad you weren't around to experience it firsthand. Or maybe you are glad. We won't judge. Wildest parties in ancient times. That's right, we're talking about the Bacchanalia and Dionysian mysteries. Back in the day, every country and people had multiple gods to worship, but the Greeks and Romans took it to a whole new level. With names like Zeus, Dionysus, and Bacchus, it's no wonder they knew how to party. The Greek mythology is full of stories of the gods and their battles, adventures, and romantic escapades, especially Zeus's. And in the springtime, they threw a huge feast in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry. So you can only imagine that unlimited amounts of wine were consumed, and the partygoers participated in performances that told the story of the god's life, death, and resurrection. These performances were called Dionysian mysteries or Bacchanalia, which later became a term for the wild behavior of the crowd during the festivities. Due to the copious amount of wine and the general atmosphere of the party, it usually ended up in an orgy. All in the name of tradition and the gods, of course. Now, you might think that the relationships between men and women during these times were nothing but debauchery, but there was still some meaning and romance to it. It's no surprise that with the arrival of Christianity, they wanted to put a stop to these parties. But the Church didn't have the moral high ground, as they tried to control people's lives with absurd and ridiculous rules and regulations. Chastity became the new trend, and any form of promiscuity was frowned upon and even punished harshly. The priests justified their actions with the story of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and her virginity. So, ladies were expected to behave themselves, even in bed with their unloved husbands. Talk about a mood killer. Welcome to the Sexed Class Medieval Style. Today we'll be discussing the do's and don'ts of a woman's behavior in bed with her husband. Ladies, keep your nightgowns on, your mouths shut, and your bodies still, or risk being accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. Yikes, talk about performance anxiety. And if your hubby gets bored, he might just rat you out to the church, and you'll end up living the life of a nun for the rest of your days. But don't worry, we've got some juicy court cases to share with you, like the one where a guy hunted his wife into bed and found her dead the next morning. Talk about a buzzkill. This scandal even made the Pope and the court members gasp in disbelief, but hey, at least they lightened up the rules a bit and allowed women to show some signs of life during the deed. It's not just medieval times that were strict about sex, though. Scientists, philosophers, priests, and lawmakers have been writing books upon books about how, when, and with whom we should do the deed since the dawn of time. Personal lives were under the constant scrutiny of the Church, and any sign of promiscuity was labeled as whorish and punishable by death. These priests sure were nosy, huh? They recorded everything in their confessionals, giving us a peek into the sex lives of our ancestors. So thank goodness we're living in the 21st century where we can enjoy the deed without fear of being burned alive or reported to the church. Let's give a round of applause for progress, folks. I'll continue our history lesson on medieval love and marriage, but don't worry. I promise to make it more entertaining than a jester's performance. Now, the church had some strict rules when it came to expressing your lusty feelings towards your beloved. No overt sexual advances were allowed, but they did acknowledge that love and sex had a common denominator. They called it courtly love, where a knight had to be fearless and a lady had to be untouchable. So basically, it was like playing hard to get on steroids. Speaking of fidelity, the church was big on it. They only allowed sexual relations within the bounds of marriage. Any hanky-panky outside of it would result in severe punishment, even death. The church played judge, jury, and executioner when it came to matters of the flesh. But hey, they had their reasons. If nobles and monarchs wanted to be sure their offspring was the real deal, then their spouses better not stray. Can't have any sneaky bastards running around the castle, right? Now let's talk about chastity belts. Yep, you heard that right. Back then, they were all the rage. Initially, these metal contraptions were designed to protect women from being raped by bandits on the road, but over time, the nobility saw the value of using them when they went on long military campaigns or journeys. It was a belt with a lock that covered a woman's nether regions and prevented any unauthorized access. It's about being secure. However, when a woman's husband was away for extended periods, they had to call in blacksmiths, witnesses, and even the church to unlock the belt in case of emergencies. That must have been one awkward conversation with the priest. And lastly, let's talk about a little thing called the right of the first night. In medieval England, a nobleman who owned land and its inhabitants had the legal right to bed a virgin bride before her wedding night. It was a law, but don't worry. The church was aware of these instances, so if you were a peasant girl, your options were either to run away, hope your groom was brave enough to fight the Lord for your honor, or pray for a merciful Lord who'd give you some wine and roses instead of his sword. Well, folks, now we're talking about the guest night, a German and Swiss tradition where a potential groom had to pass a manhood exam before getting married. Yep, you heard that right. He had to prove his worth by spending nights with his beloved, engaging in some sexual activity, and if a baby came along, it was time for a wedding. But let's not forget that even the church had a say in the bedroom activities of the common folk. Anything other than the missionary position was considered a sin and forbidden. However, the rich and noble were allowed to indulge in 4 other positions, ranked in increasing order of sinfulness: on the side, sitting, standing, and from behind. It seems like those rich folks had some creative ways to stay in shape and have fun at the same time. Now, if you were feeling a little adventurous, you might have wanted to try some oral or anal sex, or even just a little self-love. But not in medieval times. Those acts were strictly prohibited, as they didn't lead to procreation, which was the only reason for sex, according to the priests. So watch out, folks, because breaking those rules could get you in some serious trouble. Well, look what we have here. It's a topic that's sure to raise some eyebrows and spark some controversy. We're talking about homosexuality. Now, the church was not exactly a fan of same-sex relationships back in the day. Nope, they took a hard stance against it and punished violators with some serious consequences, like death. The church believed that such activities were unnatural and forbidden by God. However, it seems like the royals and nobles had a different opinion. They were often caught in the act, if you know what I mean. Take King Richard the Lionheart, for example. Instead of focusing on his bride-to-be, he was having a good time with his brother. Talk about being indecisive. Now, military campaigns were strictly off-limits for the gay community, but that didn't stop the commanders and knights from getting their kicks. They found a loophole by bringing along young boys as their personal armor-bearers, who not only served as a shield, but also as a bed warmer. That's some medieval multitasking right there. Oh, the medieval world was truly a fascinating place, where even the oldest profession in the world had its own set of rules and customs. Despite being frowned upon by the church, prostitution was a thriving industry throughout the Middle Ages. In fact, even the smallest villages had their own resident harlots, who couldn't exactly hide in the shadows since everyone knew their business. These women were constantly under threat of being beaten, disfigured, accused of adultery, and even killed for their line of work. However, things were a bit different in the cities. Here, prostitutes could offer their services anonymously without revealing their true identities. They would often ply their trade on the streets, with any passerby being a potential client, but the more privileged members of the profession had a more refined approach. They would showcase their sexual prowess in public brothels where they could attract wealthier customers. And while the church may have turned a blind eye to prostitution, they still had to maintain some semblance of moral authority. So it's no surprise that many of these brothels were located within the church's jurisdiction. After all, who better to regulate the morality of these dens of iniquity than the religious authorities themselves? And let's not forget, the church was also raking in some serious profits from these establishments. So it was a win-win situation for everyone involved, except for maybe the prostitutes themselves. But hey, let's not be too quick to judge. As the church believed, prostitution was simply a necessary evil that helped keep the sexual desires of society in check. Without it, they feared that the world would succumb to an epidemic of adultery and homosexuality. So, in a way, these brave women were doing the Lord's work by keeping the moral fabric of society from unraveling. Well, whether you agree with the church's stance on prostitution or not, there's no denying that this ancient profession played a major role in shaping the society and culture of the Middle Ages. And if there's one thing we can learn from history, it's that people will always find a way to satisfy their desires, no matter how much the powers that be try to suppress them. It seems like medieval women weren't satisfied with just good old-fashioned lovemaking. According to repentant books, they were getting freaky with some phallic-looking objects, or as we know them today, sex toys. And these ladies didn't settle for anything less than the real deal, as their toys were made out of leather and had various fillings, just like a good sandwich. But wait, there's more. Unlike today's sex toys that come in all shapes and sizes, back then there were no specific sizes for these toys. They were custom-made to satisfy the sinful desires of each woman. So if you had a craving for a giant, monstrous, phallic-shaped toy, you got it. The bigger the better. Am I right, ladies? It's fascinating to know that women were so creative with their sexual desires back then, even though it must have been tough to keep their little secrets hidden from society. But hey, who are we to judge? They were just having some good old-fashioned medieval fun. Today we're surfing the Middle Ages to explore the fashion trends of our ancestors. And let me tell you, they were wilder than we could ever imagine. We're talking about the hypertrophied gulfik, a piece of clothing that resembled a leather or fabric pouch that men wore in their groin area. This accessory was fixed with ribbons or leather belts and filled with sawdust or rags. And while it didn't serve any practical purpose, it definitely drew attention to the male anatomy. Now, while we might question the aesthetics of this piece of clothing in the modern world, there's no denying that it looked like a male member in a state of excitement. And speaking of excitement, these gulfiks were actually banned in public places, but not for the royals and their courts. Maybe they just wanted to show off their, royal lineage. And there's no shortage of paintings from the past that showcase men wearing this fashionable accessory. Just imagine walking down the street and seeing a guy with a bulging gulfik. You'd think he was just happy to see you. About contraception, or as the church called it, the devil's work. Apparently back in the day, the church was too busy catching of gays and gathering evidence for just trials in matters of relationships between men and women. You know, the usual executions to worry about birth control. I mean priorities, am I right? And don't even get me started on divorces. In medieval times, no one dared to ask for a divorce unless one of the spouses died or the man had some trouble in the bedroom. But how did you prove that? Well, the wife had to invite some church officials and women who were supposedly experts in the field. They would then examine the man's equipment and make the couple have sex in front of them. Talk about an awkward family reunion. And let's not forget about the church's selective interpretation of the Bible. Apparently, some rules were more equal than others. For example, women were expected to save themselves for their lawful husbands, but the lord of the manor could have his way with any virgin on her wedding night. I guess they forgot to add the not in that commandment. So if you thought your family had some dark secrets, just be glad you're not a medieval peasant. Stay tuned for more wild and crazy history. Dragon Rulebook, a.k.a. the medieval guide to sex that makes 50 Shades of Grey look like a children's book. According to modern sexologists and psychologists, the only people crazy enough to come up with such insane rules for sex are those with serious psychological issues, sadistic tendencies, and a whole bunch of complexes. But who actually wrote this ridiculous book, you may ask? Well, it turns out it was the monks who couldn't get any action themselves and were jealous of those who could. These holy men lived a closed-off life, avoiding all forms of temptation and sinful behavior. They saw women as the devil's spawn, trying to lure men into the depths of adultery and promiscuity. But let's be real. Here, they were probably just mad that they couldn't get any themselves, so they decided to make it their mission to create the most ridiculous rules for sex that would make no one happy, not even themselves. Now, some historians and philosophers argue that the Middle Ages were a period of stagnation where no progress was made in any field, including science and technology. But let's not forget the Church's contribution to this era of repression and sexual suppression. Not only did they refuse to acknowledge the obvious, but they also persecuted anyone who dared to speak out against their draconian beliefs. And when it came to sex, they not only refused to progress, but took society back to the days of cavemen when sex was solely for procreation. I mean, come on, guys. Who needs pleasure when you can have babies? Love in the Middle Ages. If Sigmund Freud had been alive then, he would have been out of a job. After all, having sex was considered whoredom, and adultery was punished by death, excommunication from the church, and other awful anathemas. The church was so strict that even thinking about sex was considered a sin. But the irony is that the very people who were tasked with punishing immoral behavior were the most curious about it. Priests, monks, and theologians left us with detailed accounts of how people loved in the Middle Ages, including everything from the first date to the first intimacy, even drawing diagrams for us to follow. The medieval church was like a strict parent who didn't want their kids to even think about sex. They were all like, "No sex before marriage, young man." And if you didn't listen, you'd get punished worse than when your mom caught you playing hooky. For noblemen, marital fidelity was essential to make sure that their children were actually theirs. And let's not forget the emphasis on virginity. In the Middle Ages, a girl's main wealth was her virginity. But in practice, few were able to keep it. So what was life like for the average Joe, or Joan? Well, let's just say that morals were pretty low and men were rough and persistent, especially those in the lower class. No wonder prostitution thrived during this time. But hey, people have been having sex for ages. Back then, it was a way to continue the family line. And now, with the invention of contraceptives, we can indulge in the pleasure of sex without worrying about the consequences. There are so many different techniques, types, and practices of intimacy available that it's simply mind-boggling. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give it a thumbs up, and leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. What historical period would you want to visit and why?